Hello, sweet Grandma Lou. Beginning on December 23rd, 2015, your grandchildren interviewed you and Grandpa Bob about your lives. We interviewed you on 2 separate days. This recording covers the first of those 2 days that we interviewed you. I hope that you enjoy these recordings, and thank you for enriching us with your stories, your lessons, and your love. We're all very grateful, and we all love you very, very much.
So I think the idea came about to record a conversation because we always have such good Christmas conversations. And it would be good years from now for Andrew and David and everybody else's kids, Jeff's kids, to be able to listen to that. So let's set the scene first. So we're here with Grandma Lou and Grandpa Bob. Grandpa Bob, as always, is smoking a cigarette inside. He has a Miller Lite T-shirt on. There's pictures in their apartment here. There's pictures of girls in bikinis.
Yes,
calendars.
Yeah, mostly calendars.
Lots of car posters around. No, that's not true. It's actually a really nice place. There's art everywhere. Anything else we can describe the scene? Grandma Lou, art everywhere.
Yes.
Well, the picture of the four of you sitting there like blackbirds on a wire during a snowstorm is enough to make us full of observations.
That should be our next year's Christmas card.
This happened.
Except we don't send them anymore.
All right, here's what I want to ask first. Should we start with...
Well, could we just start with, will you kind of introduce yourself and, where you were born, your names of your parents and your siblings, and your full name?
Go ahead, Lou.
Do I have to give my full name?
Yes.
There was years. The reason I said that is because for years I never told anyone my middle name because I didn't like it. I thought it was, I don't know what I thought, but I did not like that name. So as an adult, a long time into my adulthood, all of a sudden I thought, well, that was nasty of me not to like that name because it's Magdalena or Magdalene. I didn't know which. I thought it was Magdalena. And I think that was my grandmother Young's name. And so it was my middle name. And then, of course, in the Bible. But I don't think I knew about the rumors about that Magdalene at that time. But anyway, my full name is Louise Magdalene. Saw the birth certificate of my grandmother. It's Magdalene Miesbach, Miesbach. And of course, you can tell that's Irish right away. And aside, David spent $100 at least to get the DNA for us.
Wow.
Well, mine was not worth it. German.
Just 100% German?
Wow.
100% German. And I met another lady that lives in this hall down here somewhere. Same thing. We visited. She was having her apartment cleaned, and she was sitting out in the furniture out here in the hall, and I sat, and we discovered we have the same background as far as ethnicity, because I could never quite figure out about mine, because my mother had olive skin and black hair as a young woman and black eyes, and my dad was blonde and blue-eyed. That family was very light, and they supposedly were all German and met in Illinois after they'd immigrated. But anyway, my mother's family's name was Jung, and I was so hoping I was related to Carl, but I don't think so. But they Americanized or anglicized it to Young after they moved here. But it was Jung, Jung.
Yeah.
And then my father's family was always named Miesbach, but they called it Misbeck, where we grew up in Syracuse in Odo County. Why, I don't know. Part of that tribe that immigrated west, my grandfather's father and his brothers, part of them stopped off in Iowa. and the rest of them came here to Nebraska. And so my grandfather grew up in Nebraska, and I never knew any grandmothers. They'd all passed by the time I was born. And my only grandpa that I knew was Grandpa Miesbach. And that's the German pronunciation. And when my brother went to college, I have one brother, Neil, who's deceased. When he went to college, he called it by the proper name, Miesbach, because every professor at UNL would say Miesbach, not Misbeck. So, and in Iowa, they dropped the E. And maybe that was where that came from, I don't know. But I grew up on a farm from about 7 miles from Syracuse. And my address was Unadilla, and Bob can tell that story. But as I said, I didn't have any grandparent that I knew but my father's father, and he lived about half a mile from us on a farm with my 2 bachelor uncles, and my grandpa owned our farm and built the farm for my parents, a house and everything brand new. Now I thought we were really poor because of the Depression, and I look back and I think, come on. But I don't think in that particular little area that was that unusual. I think a lot of the German people right around there had farms that had been, their parents, I think, I don't know. So, but I love my grandpa. And when I was little, they had horses down there at their farm, and he had colts. They had mares and had a colt, and that colt would follow my grandpa around. That was just great. It's just like a dog, and he'd follow around. It was fun to see. I'll shut up and take a
No,
that's beautiful.
Can I just ask, do you know when your family came over from Germany? Around the year, or who it was who immigrated?
No, not really. My grandmother, Jung, was born in Germany, and she's the only one of of my family that was born there. And she came as a child with her parents, and she never really learned to read and write in English, and her English was not that great. And so my mother's so much younger than all of her siblings, 20, 25 years, 15 years older than my mother. So her nephews would be her age, and nieces. And the ones that were around that grandmother learned to speak, and they'd say a sentence, and it'd be half German and half English. Mother told me about that. So she's the only one that was born there. And my grandpa, Miesbach, I'd ask him, I said, Grandpa, tell me, you don't want to know that old stuff. That's why I'm so thrilled to have you have this, because I always wanted to know what my family had done in Germany. And I think after I don't know that my dad knew, and my uncles knew. But after Grandpa died, and they all died, there were papers, and it seemed like some were teachers, a lot were farmers. And when Bob and I went to Germany, to Europe, we found out where the Miesbachs started from. And we went particularly to see the town Miesbach, which was really close to where my family was born. And that's the name they took, I think, from that town, or gave it, I don't know.
It's south of Munich, about 40 miles, and right in the edge of the high mountains.
And it was very interesting. We stayed in, was it Garmisch, in Germany, and that was the only time we stayed in a hostel, a home. I guess, would that be a hostel?
Hospice.
Hospice would be if you were ill. I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, hostels are usually just kind of like cheap hotel room.
Yeah,
for
I didn't think
travelers.
that was right. But usually we stayed in a hotel. And this place was in a private home. When we got to that town, got off the train, that's what was available. So we went there and we walked a long way to get there and found out later that it was just about a block across the railroad from there. But guess who owned it? Frau Hess. Now that's a name from World War II.
Really?
Hess was
Rudolph Hess.
Rudolf Hess was the one who figured out how to eliminate the Jews.
Wow, crazy.
He was not a nice man, and I'm not so sure Frau Hess wasn't related to him, although she was nice to us, I guess. But
Abrupt.
Made me nervous.
Yeah.
so anyway, we rode the bus, the local bus, up the mountain and down the mountain into Bavaria to Miesbach. And it took a half a day at least to get there. And we had lunch at Miesbach, where's a restaurant. Not everybody spoke English there. And we asked this young man, he said, talk to my wife, more English or something. And then she said, right up there. And we were standing right there, and it was on the second floor. So we went up there to that restaurant to have lunch. And the people got on and off that local bus all morning. And this one lady got on and looked just like the old ladies in my hometown. On Saturday night, they'd sit in a store and they'd have their hair all covered. And that's the way she looked. She sat there. We got up to this restaurant and sat down, nobody there. And all of a sudden, there came that old lady. And she looked around, that one we'd seen on the bus. She saw us, came over and sat down. I mean, people do that, just fill up a table or something. Well, needless to say, there wasn't a heck of a lot of conversation went on, except finally I said, meine Großmutter named Miesbach. Ja, she said, and that was the extent of what I could say in German. So we went to Miesbach and looked around and tell them what you did at the railway station, Bob, when we walked around and went down there in a phone booth.
Oh, we wanted a memento from Miesbach, Germany, and hadn't figured out a way to find anything. And so I was looking in the phone book, and I found several names, Miesbach names, and I think there were 4 names on this one page, so I just tore out the page and gave it to Lou to bring home. And she was afraid the Gestapo had been watching
I
it.
was still in that mindset about the German people, even though I was one.
Yeah.
But anyway, and there was an Albrecht
Right.
Miesbach in there, and that's what was so great, because one of those bachelor uncles who was pretty fond of me as a little girl, and he was very fond of me as a little girl, very nice.
I think we gave him that
And
page.
we took that home to him because it was Uncle Albert,
Oh,
and it was Albrecht.
cool.
Wasn't
Yeah, what were you saying? What were you saying?
Can I just finish one German
Yeah.
question? Wasn't there some story about Grandma Pearl, like not speaking much German, but then on her deathbed saying something in German?
There's a whole thing about that, but Mother's education, I mean, she spoke English because all of her brothers and sisters spoke perfect English and had been to school before she had, at least country school, through the 8th grade probably. But her education was in the German Lutheran church that was in the country, where they lived in the up around Nahaka, which is close to, not very far from her. Anyway, there was hills and the woods and everything. It was a great place to visit as a kid. But anyway, she was educated by the pastor of that church, who was, really a bright man, and he taught German, to read and write in German, and she could do that. And she could do it in English too, but she didn't have much education at all. She had terrible vision, and she kept fainting and falling out of her seat at school, and she was a baby of the family, and so her mother said, "Oh, you don't have to go." Yeah, because I think my mother was spoiled rotten, really. They all adored her, but she told me as when I was an adult that she'd lay on the floor and hold her breath till she turned blue. And then one day her big brother, who was about 20 years older than she was, came in from outdoors with a bucket of water he just pumped out of the well, which was ice cold, and he walked in there and he saw her on the floor and he took that bucket of water and dumped it right on her. That's what she told me, and it was cold, and her nickname was Peggy. Her name was Pearl, but they called her Peggy when she was little, and he said, "Peggy, I'm just sick of this. Stop it." And I said, "I'll bet you didn't hold your breath anymore." "No, I didn't." She was so funny. So anyway, what did you ask me?
About speaking German.
Well, are you talking about the butchering?
Oh, no, but I think maybe I want to know
Now,
about that.
now she is.
My father and his brothers would, on the farm, would butcher, kill. I had an uncle who was a crack shot, and they would kill either the beef, the cow, the steer, or whatever it was, or a hog, and they'd all butcher it together. And my grandpa would take the lard in a big black, looked like a witch's pot, a big black pot out in the middle of the yard or farm there where there wasn't any foliage, and start a big fire, and he would melt the lard, the fat to lard. And that was his job. Well, when they went to make the sausage in our basement, because this was up at our house, we had a cement base floor in the basement, they had my dad and his two brothers would be making that sausage. They'd grind it up and then they'd season it. And my mother's job was to take a little tiny bit every once in a while and go up the stairs and cook it so they could taste to see if it was okay. And they would talk German all the time they were doing this, my dad and his brothers, and they spoke it in front of me freely. My mother, who spoke and wrote German, would come down the stairs and they'd switch to English. I thought I never could figure that out, why they did that. Because she could speak German. They weren't saying anything. I picked up enough to know that they were just talking about the sausage. But I thought that was strange, but I don't know if that's what you were referring to.
No, I thought there was some story about, like, when she was on her deathbed of, like, saying something to her mother in German.
Yeah, I've got that written down. I'll let you read it. Yeah. It's the thing, there's anger in grief. And the anger I felt was at myself for missing the great opportunity. I was really into life after death and reading about that and all that all my life with a friend in Syracuse, Nebraska. And so my mother had a bad heart and we knew she was dying. She had cancer. And so Bob and I would go to Syracuse on weekends and stay with her. And we finally, because she couldn't be alone, we had found somebody who really, off and on, who would be with her during the week and do what needed to be done because she wasn't in pain. And we had been there all weekend, and Sunday it was, late when we got home. What time was it, do you think? 10:30, something like that? At least that late, because the phone rang, and it was my cousin that lives down there, my first cousin. And she told me, she said, "I just talked to your mother, and she's gibberish." So she'd had an aphasic stroke. Well, we got to on the phone, I think, and called the doctor called, and he said, "Don't rush because her heart is in fibrillation. She's in the Syracuse hospital, and she won't last. So don't have a wreck. Just come on down." We got down there, and we were really grieving on the way down, weren't we, Bob? Yeah, and about a mile from the outskirts of Syracuse, all of a sudden, Bob and I decided, knowing my mother, she probably wouldn't die. She'd be alive still when we got there. Sure enough, she was. And she'd drift in and out of consciousness. And she said to me, what's Ma doing here?
Wow.
And that was my missed opportunity. Instead of saying, putting my counselor hat on and saying, tell me about that, I said, well, I think that was Florence Kreifels that you saw, because those two ladies had been neighbors in the farm and they both ended up in the hospital in an ambulance practically at the same time. And that might have been her, I don't know. But that was when she said, Ma, I don't remember what she said in German, but it was, I don't know whether that was, I always figured if she probably did see her mother, if there's life after death.
Wow. That's amazing.
No.
Should we, Grandpa Bob, can you kind of do the same thing? Like just, your family.
Just tell us
from
about
all-
Grandma's
Just tell
suffering.
us about Grandma's suffering. But yeah, your earliest memories, all that stuff.
I'll start out. I haven't had an exciting life like that.
I thought it was pretty exciting.
My name is Robert Bruce, Bruce, Way, W-A-Y. And I was never very proud of that name growing up because my mother called me Bobby all the time. And my dad called me Bob. And I wasn't proud of the name Bruce at all, so I didn't ever tell anybody what my middle name was. It was Robert B. And I was born in of a couple who had lived in Colorado and had homesteaded out in eastern Colorado and went broke and had decided to move back to Nebraska, where my father was from. My mother was from Colorado. And they drove back here in the spring in a snowstorm, probably not unlike today, and in an open touring car, and got back here in early April, and got out on this farm, and they had shipped their team of horses and some other household things in a cattle car. Was the only way at that time. This would have been mid-1920s. And in any event, they stayed on that farm and went further broke for about a year and a half. And Dad was just desperate to find something to do. And my father had been a mechanic during World War I, worked on airplanes, on the early airplanes. And before he went to France to drive an ambulance. But in any event, Dad was a above average mechanic. And so they moved to Syracuse, where Dad had a cousin who had a garage. And Dad went to work for him. And I suppose I was about 2 something when they moved. But I lived then in Syracuse all my life then until I ended up moving to Ralston when I went to work for OPPD. As growing up, it was in town. My memories were, other than just flashbacks, are of in town rather than a farm, but I spent a lot of days on farms, either working for farmers or all my friends mostly were farm boys. So growing up, we moved because this was Depression days and times were really tough. My dad would not accept anything from the county or any aid. The WPA and PWA were work units of the federal government who just were created in order to give people a livable wage. He's a very proud man, and he remained in Syracuse and either worked for a garage, an automotive garage, or else most of the time he had his own garage. He was really well respected in the community. He took that experience in World War One and joined the American Legion when they started the American Legion. He first got home and became very active in that, and that brought him a lot of customers. And he took care of farmers for 15, 20 miles away, would bring their cars and trucks and stuff to Dad to run the garage. When I was about 16, Dad had a chance to get out of the garage, and he was in poor health. He had had some gas during World War One, and he had terrible rheumatism. And laying around on that cold garage floor in the middle of winter was not conducive to good health. So he had an opportunity to take the test, the civil service test for a postmaster in Syracuse. There was an opening, or going to be. It was somewhat political, so he had a lot of friends who were politicians, and he milked that out well, and he scored real high. Dad had, before he enlisted in the service, he'd gone to Nebraska at that time was a 2-year college, and it was an ag college, agriculture college, and he milked cows at 3 o'clock in the morning and put himself through 2 years of college before he enlisted in the military during the war. So anyway, Dad became a postmaster then in this little town and had 3 routes at that time out of there, 3 or 4, and 2 people were clerks to help with the post office. Syracuse, Nebraska was a town of, at that time, about 850 or 900, but it had a large shopping area around which the addresses were practically all Syracuse, so they had a real active post office. And he remained in that post office until well after retirement age. And this provided them, and Mother helped in the post office at times, which allowed her to have some retirement too. So they spent their years, lived out all their years in Syracuse. And by that time, we had moved to Omaha or Ralston area. And so they had a good retirement. They had a nice little house, and just their lives, they were just real pleased with their lives, as we were of our parents' lives. That's about all I can tell you about my childhood. I had terrible hay fever and asthma. It was terrible to me, at least, which fortunately I outgrew mostly. Lived in town, worked when I had a job until I always could work for my dad in the garage and sweep the floor and clean and move vehicles around, which I loved. And I have to tell you a quick story about my driving experience. I learned to drive cars and move them around in the garage when I was about 11. And when I was about 12 one time, Dad said, "Back that old Dodge out of there and put it up in the other stall." And I did, and I got in that old Dodge, and reverse was in the wrong place. Needless to say, I backed up. I'm faster than I should have, obviously, and ran into a glass showcase which displayed spark plugs and plugs and coils and all that,
Yeah.
that kind of stuff that we sold to, and, you know, sold to customers.
Yeah, yeah.
And broke the front of that display cabinet and felt terrible. And I can remember crying and standing there watching that thing. And my father standing there wiping his greasy hands on a rag. And he said, well, get back in and do it right. It's a terrible feeling to be crying so hard that you can hardly see the front of the garage. and get in that old Dodge and shift gears like I was supposed to have. Well, that was a sight. I always had things to do when other kids had jobs. Why, I worked in the garage for nothing. And when I probably got in high school, and Dad was in the post office then, I worked in a grocery store and stocked shelves and candle leagues and did beginner work, and then worked at a Sinclair filling station and greased cars and washed and changed tires, and the tire business is a big business, and due to the way tires were made, why that constituted a lot of extra labor that I got paid 50 cents an hour or something like that, I suppose. It was a pretty good deal. And my high school was during the war, and so the pitch was everybody couldn't wait until they got out of school so they could enlist and help fight the war to protect our country, you know. And I was obsessed with that. My folks, of course, weren't having any part of that. And finally, when my senior year started, and I had carried as background 5 subjects more than the usual 4 subjects, most of my first 3 years in high school. And so I had enough credits to graduate, and convinced the superintendent of schools to say he'd graduate me from high school before the rest of the class. And so in the fall of 1944, the war was still going. And I tried to see if I could get officer training, and nobody was. They were taking people out of the military, enlisted people, rather than college age people. So I enlisted in the Coast Guard, which sounded like they had the best chance of going to college, which I never did. And anyway, I was short of 2 years, I guess, probably only a year and a half in the Coast Guard. Didn't ever go anywhere. I spent practically all my time going to school. I go and get good grades in a class, and then they'd send you on to another school rather than out in the field to work like I thought I wanted to do. So in any event, I happened to be home on leave, on a leave in transit from Connecticut, where I'd been going to school at New London, and Florida, where I was supposed to go and get on a tanker. I had a week's leave, I guess it was. In any event, the war was over. We dropped the atomic bomb in August of 1945, I guess it was. Yeah, it was. And so by the time I got halfway through 1946, I was discharged and back home. In high school too, I had On my spare time and at night, I'd work for the REA, which was a Rural Electrification Administration district in Syracuse. And they were so short of linemen and stuff. I went along with the linemen or the foreman when they had trouble at night and stuff. And I learned a lot about electricity and a lot about work at that time, because I got to learn to do some of those things, most of those things. So this gave me an automatic job when I came home. I was re-employed, and my tenure, longevity at the power district went back to when I'd worked part-time. And that's just the way they did it at that time, which really helped me when it came to time to retire, because after Lou and I married, I continued to work for the power district until at a pretty young age, I found myself in charge of the operations and construction crews, and we only had about 70 employees total, but this was a big chore for a snot-nosed kid. And I continued to do that then until the middle 60s. And we had all 3 kids by that time, and so because the REA served primarily farmers, and the expense per customer, or the expense per kilowatt hour, whichever you wish to measure by, was higher for us than it was for Omaha, because Omaha had 13, 14 counties, we had 7. So we spent a year and a half putting together a merger, which meant that our board of directors would vote to join the Omaha's Public Powers directors, but they wouldn't have any jobs, and that was a very political thing that we went through, trying to convince these fellows that for the better lives of 7,000 farms, their power costs would be reduced almost $1 million a year. And that's the way we sold the idea to these fellows to give up their directorship and join the Omaha Public Power District. We stayed in Syracuse about a year after trying to get the transition to a new power district. All of our procedures were changed, and anyway, that was a hectic year. And then we moved to Omaha. I was put in charge of a brand new service center at Papillion, which had about 75 people in it when I arrived there. And at times over the years it would vary, the employees would vary, were between 75 and 100 people, which meant we had to look after the south half of Omaha, plus the high voltage transmission lines for maintenance and operation. And that's the job I had until I retired when I was 60, and I was so full of answering the telephone and talking with the union guys and looking after public relations that I jumped at the chance to retire at 60 instead of 65, which I've never regretted.
I want you to talk about, in the Coast Guard, you were in the Caribbean, on that island,
Oh, yeah.
and radar, or whatever it was called. The kids probably don't know that.
Oh, well, Lou reminds me that when I finally, after the war was ended, of course, everything military-wise stayed in action. And it was the guys that had gone in the earliest and been in the service the longest had the most points, so they became eligible for before discharge. And Snot-Nosed Bob was 19 by that age before he got enough points to get discharged. And during the last 6 months or so, 6 or 8, I spent on a little island that was south of Jamaica. The island was about a half-mile wide and about 2 miles long, and the one end of it was jungle and mangroves with alligators, and the other end is we built a little radio station which was used for aids navigation, and it produced a signal, a coded signal, the first, fourth, and 7th minute out of every 10-minute period, and ships that were in that area could use that as for triangulation. They had a number of those little stations around, and you triangulate and get your location right away. It didn't have all these wonderful magic things that we do now to get location. But anyway, it was 5 guys. They were Coast Guardsmen, and the reason that we were there was to produce a signal. And then there was a Navy detachment, Air Sea Rescue Group, that had used a little part of that island too. But in any event, why we lived down there and pretty much shifted for ourselves. We pooled our money and hired a native Jamaican boy, a high school boy, that professed to be a cook, and he was a terrible cook. I was a better cook than he. But anyway, he cooked for us, and we spent all of our per diem on groceries and the cook business.
Government didn't take very good care of you, did they?
No, they shipped in food by PBY plane out of San Juan, and that was an experience. If the plane didn't come in with food on it, we'd go out and shoot sunfish and eat fish, which I still don't like too much. I love trout, but not fish that you can see through. But if you shoot into a school of those things, you'd be surprised how many the concussion would bring the fish to the surface. That was, I don't know whether there was anything else to.
Well, the only thing I remember is you also shot alligators for sport, and then there were
I was
wild
mostly
boars on that island.
I was mostly an observer when it came to that kind of hunting, but there were a lot of large alligators in that mangrove swamp. And I think the biggest one, the guy, and I wasn't along at the time that they got that one, it was 12 foot long. Jeez. And they had to tow it back. They couldn't get it in there. We had a landing little barge, which is kind of a flat bottom boat with a gunnel all the way around it. It was padded, and Chrysler 16-cylinder inboard engine in the thing. And we could go up in the pretty much shallows of that swamp in that thing. There was no getting out of the boat and walking around in there. If the mosquitoes that didn't carry you away, well, the alligators would. So, but we baited alligators, and then by baiting, yesterday's alligator meat went on a great big bail hook that we welded the barb on the bail hook, and alligators wouldn't know the difference. And it's like catching a big fish. And, but those were mostly the older guys that did that.
Let me go back really quick. So you both were, when you were talking, you have fun moments where you kind of smile and talk about, when you're talking about your parents. So I both want to ask you about, just describe your parents. What were your parents' personalities? You can both answer each other because you knew each other's parents. And then for bonus points, are there, for the other person, are there qualities you think they're similar to their parents? Are there things that are different? And then even more bonus points, do you see any of your parents in your children or your grandkids, et cetera, et cetera?
My goodness, that's dangerous territory. Go ahead, you're talking. Go ahead.
Well, as far as my parents, I admired my father. I worshiped my father, seemingly. He was a great teacher. He was a quiet man. And my children all got to know my parents and Lou's parents before they passed. So that was a great benefit of living in this little town where at any given day you could get both families together and just by a matter of walking half a mile. My dad was calm and my mother was anxious, I guess you'd say, about things. And she used to discipline me with a switch which was just a branch out of an apple tree, a little tiny, thin, narrow branch, and hit you in the back of your bare legs when you had shorts on. And if she was really upset and you were in the house, you might have got it with a fly swatter, which was a more lethal weapon. And it really stung a lot. I don't recall ever having a spanking from my father except once. And it really didn't amount to anything. It's a humorous little story, I guess. In our little town, we had only maybe 12 or 15 kids in a class. And one of the little tattletale boys in our class was just that, a tattletale, and he was a mama's boy. And every time something went wrong, why, he'd tell the teacher, run up and tattletale to the teacher things. He got upset at a game we were playing in the snow in the wintertime when we were, I don't know what grade we were in, probably didn't, 5th grade, I'd say. Anyway, he went and told the teacher that I'd kicked him in the stomach. Well, what he'd really done was wet his overalls because he was too busy to go to the toilet. And he told the teacher that I kicked him in the stomach and he wet his pants. And so the teacher called my mother and told her. When I got home, she said, I'm going to tell your dad. And Dad did, and due to coaching from Mother, why Dad made me, he sat on the bathroom stool and made me bend over in his lap and pat me on the back. And the next day, the truth came out that Ferd dreamed up all this punishment for me. And Mrs. Reuter, his name was Ferdinand Reuter, and if that goes down in the history books, why, so be it. But in any event, Ferdinand had dreamed up this story, and his mother never apologized to my mother. My mother was upset because his mother had blamed me terribly the day before. But in any event, that's the only time I ever got a thing. I had one other occasion when I would rather have had a spanking than what I got. But when I was probably We lived in the Davis house then. I was probably about 11. In the summertime, and, several other kids and I would go out to the Nemaha Creek, which ran southwest of Syracuse, which was just that. It was a creek. And had bullhead fish in it, and we would fish for bullheads and swim in the dirty old creek. That was the only place to swim. One day we decided to swim, and this is really a pretty dirty old creek, but there were just certain holes that were big enough and deep enough to where you could swim. And somehow or another I jumped in feet first, and or front first, I guess you'd say, and hit part of an old car body which was under the water, and gashed my left thigh, the front of my left thigh, with about a 2-inch opening. And then borrowed a handkerchief from another kid and took my handkerchief and tied it around my leg and walked back to town a mile and a half or so, I guess, on the railroad tracks. And then Mother was all, did the course, and so when Dad got home, why, he had me put my leg over the stool. We happened to have indoor plumbing in this house, so we were fortunate in that. That's another story, but I held my leg over there, and he put I poured iodine in that gash, because that's all we had. That was before, we didn't have mercurochrome until I was older. Mercurochrome didn't sting, but we had several other things that they all stung like mad. But anyway, and there was no point in stitching it up, and so I got kind of an elliptical scar in my leg because it didn't get fixed right.
So your father was very serious. He was very serious.
Very quiet.
But your mother, I mean, for people listening years from now, my memories of your mother is she was just a goofball. She was just super fun.
Well, and she became much more so that way the older she got.
Wow. I didn't know that.
Your parents, or your respective parents, would probably have seen a difference between Mom and Dana's kids. Yeah, I would say that. Did the mother didn't even see. Did Mother see Dana's kids?
Yeah,
She
I remember
died
playing.
when I was 17.
Yeah, okay.
So
You were 7 when my mother died.
I was, and I was. It was like my 11th birthday when Granddad died.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, because Greg was a baby in
He
arms,
was.
like 18 months old at Grand's funeral in that Methodist church. And he said, "Where's Gran?
Oh yeah.
Who's in that box?"
Really?
That church was
Wow.
full of people. Isn't that funny?
Dad was
pretty shy.
excuse me, my father was 6 years older than my mother. He met Mother when she was teaching school in eastern Colorado, and Dad was homesteading 14 miles from Grand's sod house where Grand grew up. And so Dad was the stable one in that marriage. And it was his nature to be. But here's the guy that had been in World War I and had worked as a mechanic and farmed and broke sod for wheat farming and done all these things. And he married a lady that was really just out of high school a year or so. And so there was that accounts for some of that difference.
But
How old were they when they had?
They were married in 1924,
I don't know.
25. Yeah, this stuff's all on the books, the two books, the red and the blue books.
Yeah.
The red book has an awful lot of more stories and dates and times, and we have a page in the first part of that red book that shows when people were born and when they married and who they married and when they had children.
And that's been something I haven't bothered to remember any of that. I know it's in the book, and then we loaned the book out, and I said, "What was such and such?" And
Yeah. But my mom, when she talks about Gran, we'll talk about that. You know, Gran was the one that would do the talking, and you know, was that your impression of her too? I mean, that she was kind of the more vocal one.
Oh, absolutely. And when we lived in Ralston, made a call, a lot of times Granddad makes a call, and he'd just say a few words. I'd answer the phone, he'd just say a few words, and then he'd
What's
say,
the weather like? You always ask about the weather.
Guess where he
so
got
do I.
There you go. So there's okay.
And I notice outside the sun has come out and the snow is like,
Just talking.
Well, yes, that was true. And the phrase that Granddad would say was, "Well, let me put Gran on. She talks faster than
That's great. That's cool.
That's funny.
she talks faster than I do."
Dad
Which
was
true.
6 years older than Mother,
Yeah.
and that accounts for some of that.
Well, my mother was born in 1900 and learned to drive when it was a car when it was first one, but my dad was just, I don't know, just 3 or 4 years older than Mother, maybe not. They met because both my great-grandparents knew one another in Illinois. They came from the east coast of Illinois. They all gravitated there. And that a lot of the German people did. And then they came west to homestead or to buy cheap land. And since they knew one another there, they lived, well, in those days, 20, 30 miles was a long way apart. And my mother's father and mother really didn't have anything. And they lived with some older couple outside of Syracuse who had no children, had lived in a great big house, and they kind of adopted my mother as a grandchild. And she called them Grandma and Grandpa, which they weren't. But anyway, then when they were teenagers, they'd go once a year, they'd see one another, and they were teenagers. They fell in love and they wanted to get married. Well, they had to wait until their house was built. My grandpa built that house, and that farm was ready. And when their parents said it was okay, because by that time, my mother's people had moved up to this timberland around Nahaka, and then had all this family, and then Mother was the last one. She was a menopausal baby.
How many siblings did Grandma Pearl have?
She had 2 brothers and 2 sisters. Wait a minute. 3 brothers and 2 sisters. Yeah.
And she was a gregarious person, wasn't she?
She was, not like Gran, but she was, don't you think?
Yeah. Yeah. she
Maybe
was
of the two
very
of them, my
friendly.
father would be more
Really?
Oh, yeah.
gregarious.
Yeah, very definitely. Lawrence was. Louise's dad worked for us at the power district for about 5 or 6 years as a custodian. And he met people very easily. I could just observe him from a distance. Always made sure he didn't ever work I never looked after that particular part of things, just because of the nepotism, probably, the potential nepotism. But Lou's father was very happy to be visiting, and he'd love to go down Main Street.
Well,
And Louise just waved her hand and said, "Me too."
Yes.
Yeah.
Good job.
So,
Good radio.
yeah, do you see, like, while we're there, do you see qualities in Grandma Lou's parents in Grandma Lou, like, specifically, and vice versa? And, like, what qualities are those?
I guess I had never particularly thought about that in that light. Lou is a I can fix anything type of person. If she has a problem, why, she's a problem solver. I see that I guess I see that in all four of our parents, because there weren't so many helpful things.
Yeah.
You just had to figure out a way to do it. I think particularly in the women, they raised gardens and canned vegetables and were real busy. They had a tough life, and I think it was easier to remember when we were in one particular category and talking about things. My folks moved from one house, old rental house, to another for a difference of 50 cents a month. And one house didn't have plumbing. And I had an outhouse and it had a pail of water that you pumped outside and carried it in. Now, Lou's family, by the time they had married, they had electricity on that farm. They were one of the early farms that had electricity, so that meant that they could have a pressure system and inside plumbing, which is really the biggest gift you could give a farmer.
Right.
To be able to go turn on a faucet or flush a stool rather than go outside.
we had an outhouse though, in case everything
Well,
fell
sure,
apart.
when the power is off,
Yeah.
right?
And then if you're a farmer, you're out there with muddy overshoes,
Oh, yeah.
you go use the outhouse rather than drag everything in. But I think I can barely remember as a small child, a lamp, one of those glass globe lamps, and there was a bracket on the wall in the kitchen, and that lamp would sit in there. And I think that might have been when the power was off or right before we had it. I don't know. But the story was that my grandpa had paid for that electricity from Nebraska City, had that line built. And interesting, it came to our house, and whoever was on the way got to hook into that he paid for. He didn't have it in his own home, that house, a half a mile away or a quarter of a mile away. He didn't have it in there. Isn't that strange? Wasn't that important to him, but wasn't that nice that he did it for us?
Yeah.
So finishing up this question, what qualities do you see in Grandpa Bob that you saw in his parents?
His father,
Really?
really. And I'll give this aside, when we were dating, we first started to date, I thought, what's wrong with this man, young man? He talked about his father a lot, all the time, and I thought, I hadn't ever been around anyone who really thought so much of their father, their parent, adored him so as that, and I thought, that's different. I mean, I love my parents, but I didn't talk about them like that. I really, really did. love my parents and I love my grandfather, and it wasn't until I was in college that I found out why I will try things and doing it. I'm not good at a lot of things, but I'll try anything. And it's because we were told, and I took a thing on Adlerian psychology, and we were to think of a sentence that someone had said to us that influenced the rest of our life. And thought about that and thought about it, and finally I came up with the one. It was my grandpa. I was out in the field. It was wartime. Couldn't have a hired man. So Pop likes to talk about this. My dad put wooden blocks on the farm-all tractor so that I could reach the pedals and drive that tractor. But I also, took the horses out and pressed corn. After the corn was, they put the seed in the ground, you needed to press that down, and you did it with big gizmo corn press or something. Had wheels.
Just had flat wheels on it.
Yeah, flat metal wheels, and you just drove down there. Well, this particular piece of property was right near my grandpa's house, and he walked out to the field to watch me drive those horses and go back and forth. And he stood there and watched, and of course I was tickled to see Grandpa. And I remembered the sentence, and it was, "There just isn't anything you can't do." I didn't remember that until I was 50 years old.
Wow. That's kind of a
In
good.
school. I
That's
was
awesome.
in school, back in school.
Do you have a sentence that's kind of a cool thing Grandma brought up, but do you have a sentence that sticks out to you that influenced your life in the same way?
No, like I said, my dad didn't talk much. My mother did all the talking.
Yeah.
And didn't say much. No, I take too much glee in remembering things about my mother. And there's a lot of that book that are, for instance, you couldn't hang any clothes on the clothesline until you washed the clothesline. In other words, the wire needed to be washed.
Details.
Because you're going to take this white sheet
Yeah.
and hang it over that wash, W-A-S-H.
Growing up, we all loved the Grandpa Bob said "Warsh."
You're just looking at me out of the corner of your eye. And
Nope, say "Warsh." Don't change
I
now.
think that's probably the famous word that
That's
I'm
the
going
best.
to remember.
Yeah, that's the famous one.
It's very Bostonian, actually, adding R's to places
Or-
that they don't actually.
Well, that's the way we learned. And it was crick. It wasn't creek.
Yeah.
We've changed that. Everything was a crick, and you did the washing.
It's awesome. Go on. All right, sir.
Well, I don't know where I was.
First in the line.
I'm 88 years old. And
Well, let me ask this. Okay, so we're obviously here not just as a pleasantry, because we adore these people. And growing up, you guys were always like the really cool grandparents. Even among our friends, you were like, you never seemed very old to us. You still don't.
They weren't.
No, of course. But you were always like, I've heard stories, you did yoga before it was in vogue. And you're talking about Adlerian psychology. You both had interests kind of off the beaten path a little bit. Was that something that united you both, that you thought differently?
I don't know. What do you think?
No, I think sex
quite
was
alike.
the
There you go.
motivating
That's what united us.
thing here.
Sex.
That's great. I love it.
Yeah. Well, that's okay.
I started dating your grandma when she was a freshman and moved to town to the big city. We were up to about 1,000 by that time in population. And took her to the movie, I guess.
I was more older than that, I think, wasn't I? But that's okay.
I don't know, but
Well, I'll tell you how we met, if you want to know that.
Yeah.
This is the story. I was in 8th grade, the summer after I was out of 8th grade, and that was a country school. And you had 8 grades, and then you took a test in Nebraska City, the county seat, and the superintendent and everything, you took a test to see if you had learned enough to go to high school.
Wow.
And you better pass it. I don't know whether anybody flunked it or not, but
Yeah, that's some of them
did they? Well, anyway, I didn't pay attention.
That one kid that wet his pants probably flunked it.
Oh, I have a story about him too. But how much time do
No,
you
we're
have?
good, we're good.
Well, now what was I saying?
You're talking about the first time you met.
Oh, well, my friend, my oldest friend who just died this last year from that community. I was in church with her all my life, and our parents were friends. She lived on a farm one side of Syracuse. I lived on a farm the other, but we knew one another from our church. And so she called one Saturday, called me, and she said, I'm going to town. Are you going to town? That was a big deal if you got to go to get groceries on Saturday and get off the farm. You know, it was a big deal. She said, some of us are going to go bike riding. Now, she was a year ahead of me in school. So she was already in high school. She was,
Take my class.
was that 2 years ahead of me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she was 2 years ahead of me in school. So, going to go bike riding. Why don't you go with us? And I said, oh, that'd be great. And we met. And so Bob and Johnny Murphy, who else was there? But they were,
I don't know, you guys had it all cooked up before.
I didn't have any part of this. I didn't know anybody. But I was riding on Johnny Murphy's handlebars. I remember that. And Highway 50 was gravel all the way to Syracuse and down to Tecumseh. And we rode down there on that road. And Bob's bicycle and Johnny Murphy's bicycle went like this. Out I went on my knees, just gravel, bloody mess. That's the first time I'd seen him. And I was just embarrassed to go to high school with bandages on my knees like a baby. I saw him, never saw anybody else.
That's awesome.
I fell in love with him, and I don't know why. Maybe it's because you were 20. I think I had, you know, now listen, I did. I just thought, oh, he's wonderful. Well, anyway, I still think he's wonderful.
That's good.
But anyway, I had a friend in Syracuse, best friend, Joyce Seaver. She was from Texas. And anyway, she and I studied together, talked together, and it was like a sister I never had. It was just great. But we were into, I'm trying to think of the word. I can't think of it. That's what happens when you're 86. You can't think of the word. But we talked about all kinds of religions, but also life after death, and then there's a whole thing on that. And psychics.
How old were you at the time?
Oh, I don't
Yeah,
think
little
I had
babies.
Dana.
No, you hadn't had Dana.
No,
yet,
but
you
Deb
had-
had polio
Yeah.
after that. So, and there's 10 years between Deb and Dana. So I don't know.
Okay.
I was 20 when I had Deb. We were married at 18. I had Deb at 20. I had David then at 22. I was about 22. And Dana, I was 30.
Okay.
So somewhere in there, and she called one day and she says, I'm going to go to Omaha. Yeah, why don't you ride along? There is some psychic it was at Methodist Hospital, whatever that was there, in a room there that they rented, and he will do readings. And so we went in one at a time. I just thought of that the other day. And he didn't know anything. He didn't ask me about Joyce or anybody. And he said to me, the first thing he said, you have been with your husband in the past lives. And it wasn't always married, or I don't know what it was, he said, whether it was father, sister, brother, whatever, but you had been with him before. So you've known one another. And I always thought, that might have been true, and that's why it was like, that was it.
Huh. And you just right away felt.
Yeah, but I didn't date him again. He didn't think I was so hot until the same year he volunteered for the Coast Guard. We had just began really seriously dating.
Yeah,
That far after? So what was the time difference between the bicycle incident and when you started
Because
dating?
then I was going to be a freshman in high school.
Yeah.
And then we didn't date till I was the end of the sophomore year or junior year, and then he was.
So it was like 2 years or so after.
I'm trying now.
I was going to tell you about the embarrassment when you come from a little town anyway, and you're 17 years old. When the guy is delivering the mail clerk comes around to
In the Coast
assembly.
Guard?
Yeah. They just call up your name, and and then throw the letter, and the guys would pass it along until you might have a whole room that's full here. Anyway, and they'd oftentimes make crude statements about who you were receiving mail from. But anyway, the thing that got me was that Lou came from this mail route address of Unadilla, and I don't think there's another Unadilla in the whole United States that I know. But to hear different mailmen try to pronounce that name, Unadilla, and then somebody, I can remember this sounds like it's racist, but I remember at a 6 o'clock dark, cold muster that we had at Manhattan Beach in Brooklyn, when they were calling my name, and the old chief was upset that it wasn't going fast enough. He wasn't reading off these names, somebody else was reading off these names. And he said, "Way, you goddamn Chinaman, get up here." I guess Way does sound as much like Chinese names as it did English. And I don't think I put that in the book because I figured that was racist.
I had an experience with that as a nickname, Lou and Way. Think about it, Lou, Way.
Yeah.
That's very Asian sounding. Well, my
Grandma was not Asian, just for those listening at home.
yeah. Well, anyway, my friend's her husband died. I guess I was working with her in the school system in the secretarial deal. Anyway, so in a little town, you take food. Anybody has a death or anything, you just take food. So I called her home, and it was a sister that answered from somewhere out of town, didn't know. And I said, now this is Lou Way, tell Ruth that I'm bringing lasagna for supper. So when Ruth got home, she said, "I don't get it. Your Asian friend is bringing lasagna for supper." And Ruth just thought that was hysterical. And I had never really thought about it.
That's funny.
Mm-hmm.
So when you, were you gonna ask one?
I was gonna say, it just going back to Grandma's story about the first time she saw Grandpa and her reaction to him. What's that from your point of view, Grandpa? What did you think of Grandma the first time you saw her sprawled out on the gravel ground, bleeding from the knees?
Felt a little guilty.
That's enough.
I didn't. They were going riding, and somebody said, "Why don't you?" I was on my bicycle downtown, and somebody said, "Why don't you we're going to ride out the bottom south of town, and on our bikes." And so they had graveled that road, and I remember there was a lot of loose gravel.
Oh, big old, yeah.
And riding a bicycle on loose gravel is really tricky. Anyway, and I can remember approaching Johnny's bike from the rear to catch up. And when I stood up to pump, like you do on a bike, why that front wheel becomes, in loose gravel, becomes pretty critical, because you're going like this, and you're going leaning back and forth sideways on a bike. And I know I hit his back wheel. And she was saying, she said handlebars, but they call those handlebars. Handlebars are what you steer with.
Oh, yeah, there was
This
that
is
grace
a sidebar on a boy's bicycle that went across, and a lady would sit like side saddle on a horse. Would be on the hind, and her weight would be distributed naturally. So when I ticked, and I just barely ticked that rear wheel on Johnny's bike, why, that just, and I almost ran into her. I didn't.
I don't
It's a wonder
remember.
I
All I
didn't.
just remember is there I was, in this gravel.
Yeah.
Then we all went back to town. I don't remember where I went or how I took care of my knees, but evidently they.
I know I didn't take care of him.
No, I know you didn't. But actually, the first time I ever met him, Gran told me this story, and my mother too. But I think it was your mother, that one of the houses he lived in was next door to a friend of my mother's when she came to town, and I was a baby, and she went to see her friend, and she saw this lady had no children, but she really thought Bob was great, and he was about 3
I suppose you've been
3 or 4, I don't know.
2 years old.
Anyway, she picked me up and went out the door and said, "Bobby, look what I have."
Wow.
And she was holding me.
Wow.
And see, we don't remember that, but our
Wow.
parents told her about that.
Wow.
They told us about that. I think that's really a sweet story.
It is a sweet story.
When did you both like have your first conversation then? Like how old would you have been?
After the bike incident.
Yeah, after the bike incident. And what was that like?
I could say something funny, but I'm not going to.
You
I
should.
suppose probably in school, because
Yeah.
we were both real busy with things, music, and vocal,
Yeah.
choral music, and I'm sure that's probably where I first.
We weren't dating. I remember you were in some group, choral group, and I was too, and we went to the air base in Lincoln to sing at the hospital, Air Base Hospital.
I was in a group of one. I sang "Old Man River."
Oh, I thought there were other guys there, but okay, whatever. But we probably talked then, and then a real funny story about this was after we had just begun dating. I was in the class play, junior class play, and a kid that he knew real well and I knew was in the play also. And when the play practice was over, Bruce, Buckshot we called him, was going to take me to my aunt's. So we got out and got in his car, to drive up to my aunt's, and Bob was in the back seat waiting for us, and he raised up out of the back seat and said, "Where do you think you're going, Buckshot?" I tell you,
Threw his hands up.
he did. He just screamed and scared us to death.
That old Motley.
Oh gosh, that was funny. But
And the best name I've ever heard, Bruce Buckshot. Wow.
just Buckshot. I don't know where that nickname
So,
came from.
but talk about again when you the start of you two dating. When did you two have good conversations together? Was there something?
I don't know. Mostly it was about his dad and fishing. He just loved to fish.
I think you're
And I not so much.
exaggerating that.
I don't know, Bob.
I don't know.
I just,
I think it's just one of those gradual things that just
I
kind of
think so.
grow on one another.
yeah, I think so.
And she had friends that were dating, guys that were friends of mine, and at that time, bear in mind this is during the war, and there was a shortage of gas, and you got one. If you lived in town, you got one stamp a month, which is 4 gallons. Well, you can't do much running around at night on dates in a little town that doesn't have a movie house yet, or it did have one and it's closed most of the time. In any event, why you did things based around who had access to some illegal gas stamps. Our stamps were for farmers, and farmers had tractor gas, the gasoline, and so that's a buckshot. His popularity was that he came off the farm, and he always had gas to buy, and he had the Model A to drive back and forth to school. So, and he was a foolish, wild kid.
Oh, buckshot.
But you couldn't pass up that opportunity if you needed some gasoline to get a gas stamp from him.
Bob, that reminds me of our really first date.
Awesome.
Because I had a phone call out on the farm. Remember that? And he didn't tell me who it was. And I had a girlfriend who was dating a guy that was in the Navy, what was it called? It was some school, and he was in Peru.
V12.
V12 school. And
OCS, officer candidate.
yeah, and down in Peru, Nebraska. And so he'd come home to go with his girlfriend, who was my friend. Anyway, he had said, or my friend, one of those had said, would you date somebody, go with somebody I'll bring home from V12 school, Peru, and we'll double date? And I said, well, sure, that'd be fine. And the phone rang out at the farm, and this voice said, oh, and I knew the name of who it was supposed to be, and he didn't tell me who it was. And I said, is this so-and-so? And he said, didn't answer, and he let me assume it was that guy, whatever the heck his name was. And so I got into town and went to my friend's house and waited there. Her boyfriend and this guy was going to pick us up. I got out there to the car, and they were hysterical because it was Bob and it wasn't Chuck or whatever. I think that was the name. Mm-hmm. Anyway, that was something else, and that was our first date. Because I talked
You tricked her into the first date, is what I'm hearing here.
And 68 years later. This is boring, Dan.
No,
this is dating advice. Okay,
No.
so if we want to get a girl,
Yeah.
you crash your bike.
Deception.
Crash your bike first.
You have a lame friend
Into
like
them.
Bruce Buckshot
Yeah.
with you.
And then trick him.
Yes. Want me to write that down?
Yeah, right. Down.
This is how you get women, guys.
This is good stuff.
Good.
So, what, you both had brothers, what, Uncle Neil was older than you by a couple of years?
5 years.
5 years. And Uncle Bill is about 5 years younger than
7.
you? 7 years younger. So what were the sibling relationships like for you both?
Mine was a take care of it type of thing, look after kind of a thing in the early years. And then my brother didn't have any of the interests that I thought he should have when I would be like maybe 12 and he would be 5. Didn't like to play ball and wouldn't play catch, and he dressed up a lot and played house a lot. And that was difficult for me to keep my trap shut. we weren't real close. We were real close. We lived in a little house. We slept in the same bedroom. We shared everything. He didn't like to fish, and he didn't like to play ball, and I resented that. But he liked to play house with other kids, and as life evolved, and I learned more about life, and he did too. We regret this, and we've been fairly close. He was very, very attentive when we had kids, and was very caring, and he really was an Uncle Bill. They were Deb and Dave and Dana were really his kids in his bachelorhood. Why they took the place of his kids. And by the way, he said to tell everybody hello.
And we
I
talked
talked to him last night.
Yeah, we talk to him every week, and sometimes I talk. And he doesn't have that much to do, and he likes to talk an hour.
And you like to talk.
And I like to talk, so it works out. But I don't, he needs to visit with him too. But I wasn't real close to my brother, that 5 years difference. And I don't know. When I was real little, I guess we probably did things together, played together. I don't remember much about that.
Oh, it's a different thing, but boy and a girl is
Yeah.
two boys.
Any idea why there was the big age span difference in both of your families?
I don't know for sure.
I never did ask my dad, and by the time I got around to asking my mom, I wondered about that very same thing, and I never really broached the subject with them. I had my own supposition. My folks were so poor, and Mom was so deprived compared to some of her friends who had more money, that I think she just thought we can't afford to have a baby. And then when she did get pregnant, she tended to dwell on the burden that being an expectant mother was faced with. And we've joked about, I don't think I put this in the book, but I'm not ashamed of it at all, that she exaggerated her beliefs, I'm sure, that when you had the baby, you've passed through the valley of the shadow of death. I remember those very words.
Doesn't sound like Grant, does it?
No, not at all.
I'm 7 years old, and I'm hearing my mother talk about she passed through the valley of the shadow of death. That plagued me for a long time. Now, I didn't obsess about it, but I would never say that or wouldn't recommend saying it.
Note to self.
Well, I had a different experience in that I think the 5-year difference was because I don't think my mother, after she had Neil, I think she had probably cysts or something. I don't know. And I know she was advised not to have a child, but she wanted another child and had me, and she said, all I wanted was a healthy baby because my brother was tiny when he was born.
Sickly.
And he was kind of sickly, and I kind of resented that, all the attention he got for that. And so And then she told me that after, and when I was born, I got a great life message on my birth. There's a birth story. And if you have a good birth story, supposedly it's just great. And I did, because she would say, oh, all I wanted was a healthy baby. And you couldn't even wait for the doctor to get there. She was out in the country and the doctor didn't make it. And so Mother and her sister-in-law, my aunt, had been picking strawberries all day. And my dad, so my aunt and my dad delivered me. I think mostly Mother did, but they were all ready in the country, and women had all of their sheets and everything sterilized in an oven and everything ready for childbirth if you have it at home. And the doctor was going to come there. So anyway, they delivered me, and my mother said, oh, and you couldn't wait for the doctor to come. And when you were born, there you were, and you had fat arms and dimples, and you just were healthy, and that's all I wanted. And then she had a hysterectomy right after that I was born. So she never would have had any more children. And so, it was, I've always written and said, I'll be on my deathbed and I'll say, well, but I'm healthy. That message is there.
Wow.
Yeah, I felt kind of bad about that, about my brother, because the message he got was just the opposite. And he had a lot of health problems. And I had things happen too, but I always thought it wasn't much. I just still was healthy.
So that there was a gratitude where no matter what, you were healthy, and that's all that mattered.
Yeah, I didn't really realize it, and that was another thing that the Adlerian thing about the sentence that meant something to you, my grandpa. Well, then the other was, what was your birth story? So that's how I came up with that. I had to think about what was my birth story. And that was my birth story. You were just a healthy baby, and you just couldn't wait to be born. And da-da-da. Bob was saying, that we, in our generation, we just really tried to create things out of whatever there was and be self-sufficient and fix it. And my dad was so good about, I'd always want to go out to the shop and work with the tools, and he'd say, well, that's okay, but you have to put them away. They were so particular. You use it, you oil it, and you put it away. So I'm not sure I was quite that particular, but I was always out there in the summer building something, and I just knew I could make a jetpack.
This is where Andrew gets it.
Yeah.
I think that's probably right. I was so enamored of Buck Rogers and Wilma in the funny papers. That was the only thing I knew to read. We didn't have a lot of books in our house, but the paper came every day, and there were comics in there, and there was Buck Rogers and Wilma, and that was futuristic.
Yeah, spaceship. They really predicted a lot of rocket ships.
Oh, it was. It had rocket ships and space stations, everything. And then Wilma had cute white boots, or they weren't colored. I mean, she had cute boots and a nice helmet, and her hair was cute. And they had these jetpacks, and she and
Buck Rogers
would just jet all over. Oh, I thought, wouldn't that be great? So I tried to build, but I knew what they looked like, but I built it out of wood. Of course, it didn't work, but gave me something to do all summer long.
Yeah.
I mean, you're stupid, aren't you, when you tell things like that about yourself?
Dan has a number of those stories about himself, too.
I'd like to hear your
Most
story.
recently from October.
What did you do in October?
Well, when I was in second grade, we had a little addition put on our house, and I remember building an airplane out of plywood with my friend Steve, and we had the sense to tie a rope. So if we got too high in the sky, we'd be able to get back down. And the thing weighed probably 150 pounds. We didn't fly.
So just to double check, your jetpack didn't work and your airplane didn't work? Question mark? Okay. So for those listening at home.
Commonality.
See, if you had Yeah.
So you've had her jetpack.
I think if we had met earlier,
Yeah, we'd
played
have had
together
something in
kids.
common. I just remember that so well. And I remember it was hot in that had probably been a shed, a tool shed built when they built the farm, and on the other side was a chicken coop or something, and then there was the chicken house, but in that shed was old, and you stepped up to get in there, and it was hot, and there were wasps in there. I never did get stung, but I was working at that anvil and everything that was there. I just thought I could do it.
Do you remember, like, dreaming of being a certain profession when you grew up? Like, that you wanted to be someone with a jetpack?
No,
Anything
I
else?
didn't. No, I wanted to be an opera singer.
Oh.
But I knew right away I wasn't talented enough to do that. But I really always liked classical music. And Bob did too. We had that in common.
Yeah, probably, I don't remember, we didn't do anything, perform anything together that I can recall in high school. And the age difference, the class difference probably made that more noticeable. I mean, I didn't have any talent. I just had always sung, and by the time I was in the 8th grade, I was being asked to sing for church and funerals. And I tell the story, I think I wrote about it in the book. Some people that went to our church had a sister that died, and they brought her to Syracuse to the funeral home, and they had the service in the mortuary. She wasn't church affiliated, and I can remember I was asked to sing for that funeral, and standing there in this cold, stark funeral home, that far away from the head of that open casket, because you crammed between the piano and the casket, singing "Going Home." And I'm telling you, and that song still I think of that every time I hear that song. And "Going Home" is a very common piece of music, but in any event, why we probably evolved then into singing together, I guess, was something that we enjoyed doing. And we just didn't sing around pop stuff. Lou would come home with sheet music from someplace in Lincoln with religious stuff for church, and it might be 10 or 12 pages long. A lot of pages in there, duets that were really difficult, and we would work and work and work on
Oh, and your mother and David, they got so sick of hearing us play. And the piano that you have, that was a biggie, having that piano, let me tell you.
Yeah.
And we'd sit there, and I could play the accompaniment, and we'd practice, and we'd do it by phrases till we thought it was just right. And I think we had a false sense of
such close harmony, and you really have to, especially if you have an ear that's sensitive to bad music, why you really work at trying to get it right.
Yeah, we both had a good sense of pitch.
And I had done duets with other people, but never difficult stuff for church. And then after we were married, why, I got asked to sing for a lot of quartet. We had 3 or 4 or 5 people from the church choir that had most of the words memorized to "Going Home." And things like that in a little town you just get called upon for not only your own church but other people's churches.
And I started to say we
mortuaries.
have a false sense of how good we were by the popularity. And now I look back and I think it's just because we were available. There wasn't anybody else, you know, to do that. And I sang at weddings and the same thing. It was the same experience. And some time ago, you know, the Hazel that you met,
Yeah.
her son married a young woman, a farm woman, whose parents had me sing at their wedding. I was just a little kid. And they had their 50th wedding anniversary
Invited
and invited us. They wanted all of the wedding party there. I didn't even remember singing for that wedding.
So you just did this, and did you get paid when you were
Oh,
doing this?
heavens, no.
Wow.
I sang all the solos in our church. The church I grew up in was the offshoot of the German Lutheran United Church of Christ. It was Evangelical and Reformed, called that. They merged with Congregational to form the United Church of Christ. But that was a very catechism church, and I sang all of the solos for everything. The pastor of that church married us. He baptized everybody, and I thought he was God when I was a little kid. He was really a nice man.
Right.
And he was a musician.
Wow.
Accompanied me a lot, and his kids were musical.
Oddly enough, we were invited to sing in Lou's church. Because I know that one minister, we had sung a duet, and I don't remember which one it was, but it was one of those long ones. And their organist was really bad, but our doctor, who accompanied us in the Methodist church, would go over there as the guest organist, and they all loved him because he could really play the organ. And so Doc played, and we went over there and sang one time, and they had recorded it. Several years later, we went down home and went to church over at her old church. And there the minister had a wire recorder, you know, one of the big old-fashioned recorders, a big reel up here. And that was the music for that Sunday in church, was recording. He didn't know we were coming, and we didn't know we were going.
I didn't remember that at all.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I
I
bet you
remember
kids need to leave, don't
Because
you?
when I heard that music starting, I can just remember that feeling in the pit of my stomach. Oh, no.
I wish that we had recordings, but we don't. It was all real. It's a real kind of thing, and we don't. That all got tossed, and probably it's a good thing. If we'd hear ourselves, we'd think.
No, we'd have bad dreams about it, I'm sure.
But the scene would be you at the piano accompanying, and then you would both just.
That's
When we
that would be the
practiced.
practice. Yeah.
So and you did that into your marriage after you had kids.
Oh, yeah, after the
Oh,
kids
yeah.
got
So-
big enough to complain.
So for how long after that did that last?
Oh, yeah.
Well, we didn't sing much in the Methodist Church in Ralston, did we? I mean, together as solos and things.
No, you did sing in the choir,
We
though.
sang in the
And
choir.
You directed the choir that one year.
Yeah, I did direct for a while.
And our organist at Countryside was the organist in Ralston for us, so we knew her, Diane.
Diane
Yeah.
Hill, And then she played for Dana's wedding down at St. John's on the Creighton campus. We had Diane come down. But
And she finally, this year, hung up the organ playing. She just wants to enjoy life a little bit. Her husband's dead.
you asked me if I ever dreamed. I had a dream that I remember that has to do with music. Years and years ago, I had this dream, and it was so real. I was out in the audience. There was something going on up on the stage, auditions or something. And I guess I was to go on up. Somehow I got up on the stage and I played the piano, first of all. I played beautifully. And then I sang it. Oh, And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm dead. I thought I've died because knew I could not have done that, really. So I'm looking forward to that. It was just the most realistic dream. And I was just going away there. It was playing the piano, just and singing like an opera star, and just so easy. And then I realized, you're a goner.
Just a
Isn't
few
it
more
something?
things. Just like we'll just finish on that topic. Were you gonna say something?
No.
Oh, maybe to close ish. What you know what? I'd say advice, but yeah, what advice would you give? You know, in this different world that we're now, as far as a successful marriage, you know, raising kids, whatever.
Mostly just for Dan and I.
Yeah, correct.
Well, I don't think anybody does that anymore, but when we were married, first of all, society expected you to stay together, and for goodness sake, your parents didn't want to have anybody divorced in the family. And we got married thinking, well, this is it. We're married. Mm-hmm. And even when things were rough, I always knew I wouldn't want to be married to anybody else because Bob had the same values I had. Told the truth, honest as the day is long, and faithful. He was brought up like that. I was brought up like that, my parents. And so you just get through all of that, and you don't have to be happy. You just have to be, have a lot of grit to stay married. And then you are married long enough and you think, as long as you're married, might as well be happy. You know what I'm saying? You just kind of make a decision, don't you think?
Yeah, well, we haven't quite reached that stage yet.
Oh yeah,
There's still time.
we still
We've only been married 68 and a half years. So
we still get. But
68 and 3/4, excuse me.
yeah,
Thank you, David.
yeah, it was a long hot summer, but we planned to get back in the same bed eventually. That's the first time we've ever been apart. Sleeping conditions, you know, he's there and I'm there.
Yeah.
Because he was sick, but anyway.
But values,
I would say, are the main thing. Because there were a lot of guys that I thought were good looking and all of that kind of thing. And some of our friends thought they were, and I thought, but I wouldn't want to be married to them, even though they ended up very wealthy, because they would try to sneak into a drive-in theater without paying. And they could pay over and over again. And see, Bob and I we were in the back seat when that happened, and I thought, that's just awful. That's so dishonest. And my dad always said, you know, his word was good enough. I mean, if he said it, it was true. And Bob talked about my dad being the janitor down there in Syracuse. My dad retired when he was 50 from the farm, maybe 52.
We had to, because
He had rheumatoid arthritis so bad,
his hands were so deformed he couldn't hold on to a shovel.
gosh.
and
I
it
mean,
was
he
just
left
really.
for-
But you know, he didn't complain a lot about it. But
He just couldn't farm anymore.
no, and so when he retired and rented the farm to somebody. At first, and they built a house in Syracuse. At first, that was enough income that they could live on that. The economy was so different. Well, then I think they thought, well, we better have a little more money here. So my dad worked for what was that? The PMA or something? I don't know. He worked for some farm group or something, and I don't know exactly what he did. He was with that. Then he did that at the Eastern, and then he worked for the mortician And that was a great job for him because he dressed up, put a suit on and a tie, and handed out the bulletins at the mortuary. He knew everybody all around the community, which the mortician didn't know at that time.
Very caring man anyway.
Oh, yeah, and the young guy that was part of that worked there, he just thought my dad hung the moon. No wonder Mom and Dad inherited my uncle and aunt's house there in Syracuse, and my dad said to me one day, you know, he's a young guy just getting started. I think I'll just make him a really good price on that house. He practically gave it away, and I said, well, it's your house. You do what you want to. Well, you know, they loved my dad, didn't they?
Oh, yeah.
When he died, they stood there and wept. And I thought that was payment for his steadfastness.
I think the greatest disappointment we were talking about a little while ago, with me, my disappointments were practically all centered around work and what didn't go well or what I hadn't accomplished, which goes back to the fact that I never went to college.
That was a biggie.
Yeah, that was probably the biggest obstacle to our early marriage.
Good for you.
Because at the time we married, we kept thinking, well, you know, I had some GI training coming, and that's why I used it to go to college. Well, I never got around to going to college. I was always too busy working.
I don't know why, you know, I went to college for a year, and then he came home, we were engaged for a year, and we got married, but I always felt like if he wouldn't have married me, you'd have gone to college.
All right.
Well,
That's
one
not
thing
true,
that
I don't
happened,
think.
Bob, I remember you looked into it, but the engineering school was full.
Oh,
You
yeah, I
couldn't get
even-
in there. And
I
of
went up
course,
to the electrical engineering building, and I had met this professor, when I was still in high school. I'd been up there for something else. I was taking those lessons over there at the music college. But in any event, Professor Norris was the honcho at the electrical engineering school. And I went up there to talk to him just within weeks of the time I got home. Took a day off work and I made an appointment. And he said, you know, you're too late for this year. This was like in June or May or June. And we got a list of people standing in line.
Yeah.
Everybody came home from the service and everybody had GI training available. And everybody's going to go to college. And those other guys went. They waited until they could get in and went, and I stayed home. And
got
it's
married,
my own
that's what
damn fault.
happened. We didn't have kids. I mean, we could have done it. We could have lived out at Huskerville or something, and we just didn't. I think I didn't have the idea that I could support us or something. I don't know, but whatever.
Well,
Anyway, it's
we
worked
didn't-
out.
Yeah, it turned out okay.
That's all that matters. But the GIs were just thick in the music school too, and they'd be in there. They'd be older than the rest of us, and they'd be in their uniforms because they didn't have money to buy different clothes. That place was University of Nebraska. Lincoln was packed right after the war. Well,
Cool. Yeah.
are you tired of this?
No, that was.
No, it's great. Tomorrow or whenever
Yeah.
we do, I want to
Yeah.
ask about kids.
Yeah, then we'll go to that.
Yeah.
We did
Yeah.
a good pre-kids thing. It was great.
Okay,
I think
well,
it's really
yeah.
important to get that history.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I want to add one thing. I dearly loved Bob's parents. I loved Gran and Granddad. They were just another set of parents for me. I loved them, and his mother might have been brusque to other people, but every time she introduced me, it was, this is the daughter I never had. I mean, she loved me too, and Granddad did too. He just was quieter about
Well,
it.
news folks love me.
Oh,
you know, I
gosh, my
did-
dad, talk about important, how he,
Oh,
he thought Bob was the smartest thing that ever lived.
well, you know,
He didn't like you at first, but
was gonna
he
say-
didn't want me to get married.
I didn't know until in later years people told me what he would say about me, because he'd be around there eavesdropping like he always, like everybody did at board meetings and stuff. And then these people would talk about how great Bob Way was and how lucky Irv Smith was, the manager, to have me to
Hazel's
step in
husband.
and take care of things just on my own. And that was very rewarding to me to hear those rumors that Grandpa he really liked me. Because when we got married, Lou had told me what Grandpa had told her.
I overheard that. He didn't tell me.
Okay.
I was taking a shower in the basement of our house on the farm, and you could hear what was said upstairs. And my dad was talking to my mother, and he said, "If she marries that guy, she better not come crying home to me." And I thought, I never would. And that's a good thing to think. Don't go crying home. Just stick it out.
Yeah.
There's your advice.
When Lou was pregnant with Deb, I guess, that winter before Deb was born, was really a tough winter. It started out in about October having blizzards, and the power district, and the rural power district in particular, is really at the mercy with ice storms and stuff. And besides all the work headaches I had, Grandma got sick.
My mother.
Yeah, Grandma Pearl did. And bear in mind, they lived 6 miles from town, 4 miles west and 2 miles south. All of it mud roads except a couple, and they weren't well maintained. And then when it would snow, the farmers would just drive through the fields in order to get to town. And they'd take one another's fences down and drive through, and if it was off the road, nobody complained about it. And I can remember driving out there to help take care of Grandma. And Lou was in the driver's seat, and we had that old 38 Chevy. And chains on it, as I recall.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, we got stuck a couple of times, and then Lou would drive, and I would scoop and push and scoop and push. And in one place I remember, it was after we turned south, I got clear up on the side hill on this farm before I could find a little enough snow that I thought I could get through. You know how the wind will blow snow in different places on different hills. And I remember taking that fence down
I remember that too.
and going back later and putting it up again.
And going to the field
We went out there to just really,
just because of Mother.
yeah, and mostly to reassure ourselves that she was okay. Anyway, Grandma wanted a back rub. And here's a freshly married guy whose wife is bearing their first child, and Grandma wanted her back rubbed, and she didn't have any closure on the back side of her nightgown. It was her own bollocky bare asses out there.
She
Can
was
you
not-
imagine a
She
lady
wasn't modest
in
about it.
this age not having,
Yeah, I
be
just that's
confident enough that I didn't spank her like I should have when I got through. But
Well-
and Grandpa, little things that I know. One time, we used to go out there that fall before that winter in the late afternoon or when I'd get off work, and Grandpa would be coming in out of the field with a load of corn, with a shuck of corn, and to get it up in the granary for storage, why you would take one horse out of the team of wagon. In other words, he'd come in with a lumber wagon back of his team and a bang board on one side of it where when you threw the corn, you could just bank it against that and it would fall into the bed. And you take this horse loose and you'd have a turntable out there and an elevator. And the elevator would get the corn up, but you had to have something to power that elevator. So you had this turntable and you had this horse, and this horse just walked around in circles all the time, and you were pulling this fresh load of corn into the elevator hopper. Well, the next year, I made a deal. I couldn't afford to buy it, but I made a deal with Grandpa that would he pay for an electric motor if I could figure out a way to use electricity to get that corn in the granary. And he said yes. And so when Don Thompson, our office manager, went to Lincoln the next time, I had him bring home a 3-horse motor, which is a good size motor, but it was a good sized load to be moved. And took the bottom part of his elevator apart and put this motor on a wood platform plank and bought an old Chevy transmission and V-belts and V sprockets and V-belts to go from the back of the transmission to the elevator mechanism, and got that all figured out and put it together. Of course, you could barely lift the damn thing, but that's beside the point. Then bought wire and climbed the yard pole in the yard and electrified the granary, which it needed electrifying anyway, and wired it so that there were some lights in there. And lo and behold, the damn thing worked like a top. And Grandpa never forgot that. What a deal. And several times I overheard him tell me about, oh, that son-in-law bought this old transmission. This electric motor.
He went from,
He got
she
that all
marries that
figured
guy
out.
to, what a swell fella.
Oh, anyway.
Well, you guys,
It's your phone. I'll take one.
I'm sorry we didn't have
No, this is great. I want to get just a picture.
Oh, yeah.
Sit where you are. You're good. Don't pose. Just
I
talk.
want to do one for this.
well, let's see.
Yeah. But what we'll do is, this is great because we'll do kids next time. We'll kind of get to that, you know.
I sure hope that this recording.
Oh, this is going to be amazing. You have no
You have to
idea.
go
I hope
through
there isn't
this.
anything embarrassing.
Oh, there is plenty.
I'd like to talk about when my mother died and you at 7 and your interest in death. I don't know how much you remember.
Do you remember you and Grandpa Bob going over to the Lutheran church, and there was a little bench back around the back of a little area on the north side of that Lutheran church that night, that evening at dusk, and it was so peaceful back there. We talked about that.
You were staying with us, and then you went to Syracuse with us the next day.
This is for Grandma Pearl's funeral.
Whoa.
Yeah, well, this was
And you were
the
7,
day
I
that,
think, which is a good time for children to really be curious
Oh
about
yeah,
death.
we have a
and
lot
dying.
of death conversations.
So what did she ask, and what did you talk about then?
Well, mostly we
I guess we did the most talking
we were
then.
informative.
But Lauren is a very sensitive little girl, and she dearly loved her grandma, and her grandma died. And this was her first real exposure to death that I can remember of.
Oh, you were curious.
And so we just talked, and we didn't really talk about anything in particular.
And then we went down to Grandma's and stayed there overnight. But you didn't want to sleep in Grandma's bed with me. That was the one thing you said, no, you didn't want to sleep there. So you and I slept in the guest room, and Grandpa Bob slept on Grandma's bed. And then I told you, I said, well, we're going up to the mortuary, and Grandma will be in a in a casket, in a box, in a casket, and she's going to be dead. She is not going to look like alive, and she's not asleep. She's dead, and you don't have to go up there at all. Go to that. No, you kind of wanted to go.
You know what's cool? I just had we had this lady come in who has a nonprofit for kids that have just lost a parent. And she said to do it exactly like you just did, where you're not beating around the bush. You're not saying, oh, they passed away, and you're like making euphemisms.
You got to use the word death and dying and all of that.
Absolutely. That's beautiful. No, that's perfect.
Well, I don't know. Did it affect your life anyway?
Terribly.
No,
No.
it's, yeah.
I remember Granddad's funeral and I remember Grand's funeral. I have a little bit of memory of not wanting to sleep in Grandma Pearl's bed.
Do you really?
Yeah. Once you say that.
You remember Grandma Pearl's house and
I remember she had a drawer that had
Toy
toys
drawer.
in it
Oh,
that
yeah.
had a doll that you could pull out
I
and
know.
it would talk, and the phone.
I never had room enough in a house to have a drawer to have toys in it, but that was really great. Every grandkid loved that.
Yeah.
It was in the hall, and she had a big drawer right on the floor and had toys in it. And everybody ran in there and opened that drawer right
do you
away.
remember Marble Game?
That's popular still.
That
Play with
our
it.
kids were playing with it
This
when we
morning.
left the house today.
Yeah. That thing has got some use out of it.
Yeah.
If only every toy lasted that long.
Oh, I know, but you repaired it too, didn't you? Or
Yeah,
you did,
multiple
or somebody
times.
did.
You soldered it, I remember.
I don't remember what I
That
did. I remember
spring-
one time I fixed it with several different things, but one time I took a tin snips and took a can, just a bean can or a vegetable can, and cut out a piece of sheet metal so big and formed it so that where that marble came out of that top end of that chute,
Yeah.
we had an extension on the chute, I guess. I forgot now how to do it.
That's like a pinball machine.
Oh, that
isn't
thing-
it?
It's lasted through
Yeah.
so many generations
It's
of
crazy.
playing.
I love these
Amazing.
stories of Grandpa just like fixing things out of nothing because apparently I've married you.
Yes.
Do you think so?
Yes.
And how it instantly, well, everybody loved you right away, but how it just changes the opinion of somebody. Yes, this works now.
Right.
All right, I guess you're all right.
Yeah, you're good.
He's cool.
You're hired.
Yeah.
And your boys are that way too, aren't they? They fix things and
sure.
are curious and
I'll never forget this video of Andrew that one of you sent me. He's like, I was probably like 5 or something. He's like, it's broken, and I gotta fix it.
gotta fix it. Oh, that's great.
That is
Oh,
great.